Hey there, you are either watching or listening to The Climb, and my name is John Sirakis. This is brought to you by the Digital Mastermind. Digital Mastermind is a group of agency owners, technologists, marketers, and everything in between. And we still have some tickets left for our summit, October 16th, 17th, 18th, and 19th in sunny St. Augustine, Florida. So visit the website, check that out. If you want to join, go ahead and shoot me an email, Jon, at digitalmastermind.com. All right. Everyone trashes the dreamer and the person that's looking for shiny things. The current thought is that only focus on what's in front of you and discard everything else. And there's tons of different gurus and experts that say, that's exactly what you need to do. For instance, Warren Buffett has a famous quote about how that works. It's the 25 and 5 rule, where you write down 25 goals that you want to accomplish for the year, then you narrow it down to 5, and you only do those things, just brutal sacrifice. But when you actually don't dream and you don't have that time for imagination and vision, you're potentially not going to be able to see what's around that corner. And then you're going to find yourself somewhere in the middle, and you may tell yourself that you're happy. Just because you're telling yourself that doesn't mean you could do and can do so much. So the point is that you can get complacent by not actually looking for those things that could make your business that much better. And it's not getting away from process and doing things the right way, but it's creating the space to actually dream a little, or figuring out what your R&D looks like. And then when you run into those situations, you're not only going to be ahead of your competition because you're not looking at them necessarily, you're going to be able to adapt more because that is now going to be a part of your structure. So a little bit of that is what we talked about with my awesome guest and the author of The Amazon Way, John Rossman. But before we get into that, Dave, why don't you come on out here?
Hey, how's it going?
Going great, man. How are you?
Doing well.
All right.
Shiny things. So, I mean, this is the eternal battle. You and I, you're a shiny thing guy. You're the visionary, and I'm what's the EOS term for the
implementer?
The implementer, And so I try to say, stay focused on the current mission and stop chasing shiny things. But when it comes to business goals and business dreams, I'm not so much of a stickler. When I say stay away from shiny things, it's more about tooling and apps and stuff like that. It's like, once you find project management that works for you, you don't need to find another one. I don't care if a new one has a new feature. There's a cost to training and switching, and that's what mostly I try to stay away from, is the operational shiny things, because you can change your tools every year. You can change how you do your CRM, how you track leads, how that changes all the time. And how much energy are you burning just changing?
I agree, and I think that's where we make a good combo, because I'd say you have on the operation side a discipline on saying, like, okay, this is our tool set, these are the tools that we're going to use, and we're not going to abandon just because we don't feel good about it or the competition likes it, right? It has to be a really good reason or a business case. And I think in that structure, that's really strong from a process and system standpoint. But I always look to, not necessarily the competition, hey, this is what they're doing, but like, hey, this is potentially a market that we should enter, or hey, this is something that could make us better, or this is something that we've experimented, and we'll give out one of those tips where we're going to give some type of timeline to our clients, right? So we're giving them that visualization so they're not continually checking with us. And the irony of that is that's something that Amazon did at their beginning.
There's so many business philosophies out there, because we as a company just read Traction, the EOS, a book about EOS, and in that it says stay focus on exactly only what you do best, and just double down on that. Don't worry about a new market, a new product, a new shiny thing. There's just so many perspectives out there, and you really have to figure out.
It's interesting that you bring that up from the branding perspective, right? So when I was learning branding in 2000, 2001, going to school, there was all of this. I think Al Rise wrote one of the books, some of the 22 immutable laws of branding and some of these other things, where if you make a beer, like you only make that beer. You don't go and make cherry flavored beer. You don't go and make light beers. Like that's what you're supposed to do. But there's so much data that completely contrasts to that, because you had Budweiser, then you had Bud Light, and then you have all these other things that they're experimenting with. Procter and Gamble's done a really good job on that. But now, all right, the point I'm making, you get into the technology world, and we have these behemoths such as Google, Amazon, and they have like all of these different products that is just like, all right, their brand as a whole, but then they have all of these different little lines. And yeah, so you're absolutely right. There's all of these different ways to do it. Procter and Gamble, though, goes the complete other side, also a behemoth, and they create a separate brand for each one of their little products. It's not.
Yeah, I mean, you can make the case for either way, because Coca-Cola, I mean, they make a lemon lime drink, they give it another brand. They don't call it Coca-Cola, clear. They did have a Coca-Cola clear, but
no, that was Pepsi, wasn't it?
Pepsi, yeah. I thought they both came out with one. They always seem to copy.
They may have, but dude, that Pepsi Clear was trash, man.
Yeah, but I mean, they do. They create, Bud Light, Budweiser, Bud Light. It's close, but it's still really its own brand.
Yeah,
but I do find it funny how they reuse the Bud Light brand over and over again. Bud Light Seltzer, Bud Light. They have lots of Bud Light hard tea. I don't know, but they don't reuse Budweiser, and I wonder if that's just a brand pride thing, because that was their first thing, and they don't want to dilute it.
I don't know, man. I'll tell you what, like, people trash Budweiser, but dude, like that to me is still like a really good beer. Like, I don't drink a lot of beer, and maybe that's why, but I don't know. Like, you take a sip, it's like, damn, that's just a good lager.
So when it's a hot day and it's your first beer, I mean, the Miller Lights, the Budweisers, all them American classic beers are a refreshing beer on a hot day.
They are. That's true. Yeah, you think beer sales would go through the roof here in Florida right now, because it's as hot as it is. But I think, I mean, we make a good combo, and I think that some of the others, because I know a lot of people are going to read traction, and maybe they don't have the diversity of thought that we necessarily do, and in doing that, they're just going to be heads down and like, all right, this is all I have to do, right? But you can't do that. All you're literally doing is just following all the masses, right? You have to be different in a lot of ways. The other thing too is, especially reading in his book, and it's something that I love, is he explains where Amazon has not where they literally have to fight internally to have them look at the competition, because they're so like, the competition doesn't matter because of the tenets that we're following based on like customer obsession, price and value, speed, and all these other different things, which, dude, I mean, we talk to a lot of agency owners, and a lot of them are just like, oh, well, that's what so-and-so is doing, and they're going to adopt a new project management system, or, hey, that's what so-and-so is doing, and we need to use that web platform and get away from WordPress, not realizing the consequences of that. And then they wonder, while they're flatlined for so long, and now profitability with recession and inflation, stagflation, whatever words you want to use, that's where they're now getting their lunch eaten, because they were too busy just continually tooling around on the wrong things.
A point on the Warren Buffett rule of 25 and 5 rule. I think it's way easier to have 25 dreams when you're confident and your outlook is positive than when you think you're looking into a recession. And I think you have to be flexible enough to say, hey, this is not a time to be dreaming. Let's just, do all the basics the best we possibly can. Mm-hmm. So I do think there is an ebb and flow based on the economic kind of confidence that, the climate's given us. So you have to be flexible enough to dream, and sometimes you got to batten down the hatches.
Yeah, and on this episode, he explains a little bit about kind of the shiny things, which is something that's always near and dear to myself. But I dropped the book real quick, so bear with me. This is our interview with John Rossman. This is a fantastic book. The guy, he's a good writer, man. I read a lot of business books, but this one really flows. So go ahead, give this a listen. You like it, check out the book. Even if you don't like it, check out the book. It's worthwhile. Thank you so much. John, thank you so much for joining us.
Hey, great to be here. Thanks for having me on the climb.
All right. So I'd like to start with your climb. How did you get here?
Well, a long story. I'll keep it short. I studied engineering in college. I went to Oregon State University. And what I've always been interested in is integration and efficiency, whether that's data integrations, process integration, company integration, strategy integration, and ecosystems. And it hasn't been a planned career, but as I look back over the span of my career, what I've always been interested in is creating new capabilities that service, customers or employees. And typically, like, integration of experiences has been key. And so I've just led, kind of a career of primarily consulting and operating, launching new capabilities to integrate and create better outcomes for customers and for employees.
So you went from engineering and then organically like fell into kind of like customer experience strategy. Like, what does that look like? Because that doesn't sound like the
Yeah,
normal path.
a 35-year overnight success, right? So yeah, I was in consulting early in my career, more systems consulting. I was a partner at Arthur Andersen. I joined Amazon in early 2002. I was recruited to help launch and scale the marketplace business at Amazon. So the marketplace business at Amazon is today 58% of all units shipped and sold, over 2 million sellers on that platform. We launched it in 2002. I ran that business and another business at Amazon for a couple of years. I left Amazon in late 2005, was a partner at a strategy firm. And really from there, I started to, being at Amazon just changed fundamentally, like how I break down problems, how I communicate, how I structure my thinking, how I think about strategy. And I started to use all these little levers and knobs and approaches from Amazon in my client work. And, the story of the book, The Amazon Way, is I had a client at the Gates Foundation, and he pulled me into his office one day and he said, "You do a really subtle job, nice job of kind of inserting all these ideas. I think you ought to write a book about that." And the smartest thing I did was talk him into being my partner on the books. And that's really been kind of the journey propelled from writing The Amazon Way and a couple of other books.
So starting, like, can you describe what it was like in 2002, what it's potentially like now? Like, how many employees was it? What was that like for
Yeah.
you? Did you meet Jeff Bezos?
Yeah, absolutely. So to put it in context, today, Amazon is a roughly $480 billion annual revenue company. When holiday 2002, so that fourth quarter of Amazon in 2002 was the first $1 billion quarter for Amazon, right? So 480 billion annual, first $1 billion quarter. At that point, 90% of the business was books, music, video. Today, Amazon is a conglomerate business with AWS, retail, marketplace, logistics, Kindle, devices, all these other platforms. And we had $1 billion of cash and short-term receivables at Amazon at that time, right? So we knew we were going to survive. So we were slightly past kind of like, is Amazon going to survive phase? But we were still highly doubted, lots of naysayers. But one of the things I appreciate about those times was Amazon and Jeff operated with the same focus on all of these principles, the leadership principles of Amazon. They weren't written down at that point, but we were hammering them out. We were codifying every day. And he was always thinking big and was patient about the right things and impatient about the right things. And I learned so much from that environment about, understanding those two. And, one of the little tricks relative to that is understanding your outputs versus your inputs. When you're setting goals, and I know that's one of the key themes of the climb, is like, how do we set goals, right? Well, I'll talk about the 14th leadership principle and how to set goals and focus more on your controllable inputs than your uncontrollable outputs or results.
Got it. So, you didn't. It surprises me that there was nothing like written down. You guys, it was just all just culture, right? Hires and just tons of repetition in what you guys were doing.
Yeah, but this is early at Amazon, and it was a couple years after I left. When Amazon codified these leadership principles and everything, at that point, clearly customer centricity and customer obsession was like, okay, that's who we are. From day one, Jeff always said, like, we're going to be the world's most customer centric company ever. And he meant it. And he employed that. But it was really through a number of other leaders and struggles and how to scale and how to succeed that these other leadership principles started developing, and they recognized, I think it was about the 2006, 2007 timeframe where they recognized, like, hey, we're at a point where we understand ourselves well, we understand our culture, and we need to scale it. Let's write down our leadership principles. And so that's when they wrote down the leadership principles. Most companies today don't have truly a set of tenets or approaches that are meaningful in everyday conversations, everyday decisions, everyday struggles, that help teams, approach things or overcome problems in consistent manners, right? With consistent first principle approaches.
I agree. They do vision and mission and core
right.
values, and then they call it a
day. Do the right things, treat each other nice. And while those are important, like, it's tough to know, well, do I do A or B? What sort of mutual expectations can we have out of each other? Like, how do we prioritize choices? Those sorts of things, or principles, approaches, or visions don't help you do those types of things well.
So you go from, you have this meeting, you partner up with another gentleman, and then you're like, all right, I'm going to go ahead and write this book. Have you written a book before? Like, how did you have all these things written down? Like, what did that look like?
I wish I had so much bravado and instant self-confidence and everything. Like, I always say, like, I was an engineer and a consultant. I could hardly do PowerPoint, and everything. And so what I did was I just structured my communication of the book, right? And so I said, okay, like, the first big breakthrough was figuring out, like, I had all these ideas, this set of concepts from Amazon. I was like, well, how do I pick a storyline for that and everything? And so the first interchange, the first thing was, well, let's tell these stories through the lens of the leadership principle. Oh, guess what? At that point it was 14 leadership principles. Now it's 16 leadership principles. Guess what? We have 14 chapters. Each one is one of the leadership principles, and we'll do an introduction and a summary at the end, right? Okay, now I knew my book. And then for each leadership principle, I just wrote out, like, okay, what's a couple of stories that I personally have relative to that leadership principle? And then, like, what's the takeaway for the reader? Like, how does a leader put these in practice? One of my beliefs, and I always say, like, these books, the work I do, it's never about Amazon. It's about what you can learn from a company like Amazon, not solely Amazon, but like Amazon, to help you think better about whatever situation or problem or opportunity that you're trying to figure out. And so it's always about you, the reader, you, the client, your situation. And so I just tried to make each chapter relatable and give you a set of questions to ponder or exercises to do. And, once I had that, I had a little bit of support on the writing. But the book really, kind of came out pretty saliently from that. When you're writing a book, it's really important to have a team, right? You need to have an editor. You need to have a copy editor. You need to have a team that is giving you critical feedback, not like, hey, good job feedback, but like tactical, critical feedback. And just always make it shorter than you think it can be, and everything, right? Like, minimalist writing, I think, is a superpower. We'll talk more about that, but more is not better when it comes to writing.
How far did you have to cut it down?
That wasn't a big problem on this particular book. I did a second book called Think Like Amazon, 50 and a half Ideas to Become a Digital Leader. That one, I had a bit more of a pairing exercise to do. It wasn't tough. One part of that is just like, what is the critical concepts to include in that book? And so we threw out some things, and then literally going through word by word and just dispensing with all of the fluff words, right? Very, or really, or, the words like that. Just adjectives, adverbs just don't add value to the core concepts. That's kind of the Mailer, Norman Mailer school of writing. And that that just helps make super tight verses.
All right, so you write this book, and I want to get into like what some people's takeaways would be in there, and then how do you use the book as a vehicle to grow essentially your consultancy and what you do now?
Well, again, like most things I've done, it wasn't necessarily by plan. It was kind of like, oh gosh, this is a superpower. You know, I was a partner at a firm called Alvarez and Marcel, and my boss, a super guy, super supporter of mine, named Tom Elsenbrook. He got an early version of it, and we had dinner in Houston, and he was like, John, this book's going to change your life. And it was like, I was like, no, Tom, it's not. We'll go talk to some clients and everything, but it's not going to change my life. It's like a good book. Doesn't have to be great, but a good book with an appropriate amount of PR and publicity and willingness to keep leaning into the activity, like doing conversations like this. You can make change happen through that, right? And so, what I noticed was pretty quickly after launching the book, I started to get invites to speak. I got an invitation at Microsoft to speak. I got an invitation at Starbucks to speak. I got invitation from A&M clients, and I was like, "Oh, that's interesting. I'm not good at it, but I'll keep practicing at it." Right? I was used to high pressure conversations, right? And so through my consulting as a partner, I was used to having direct, specific, challenge based conversations with my clients, where I was pressure testing them or they were pressure testing me on a concept or a piece of feedback or a plan or a project. And so I was used to high pressure conversations, but that's slightly different than a keynote that is, not boring, halfway entertaining, and delivers the promise to your audience, which is, hey, we're going to learn something today, right? Like that's my promise to my audience. And so I just kept at it. And early on, I just said, hey, I'm going to charge for these things. Like the best way to create quality of anything is to charge for it, because it sets the expectation from everybody involved that there's value here. And so while the money is nice, charging premium prices, I think when you're doing when you think you have something of value, sets the expectation for everybody involved, like, hey, we're making value here. Pay attention, make it an excellent event. And so I just started doing these keynote events, and for a few years there, I made that the vast majority of my business. Today, I'm kind of balanced, 50-50 between keynote speaking and workshops, and then consulting projects and advisory work that I do. And I find that balance helps keep me really sharp. And I really like solving hard problems, like real problems. And so I really like the consulting and advisory work. But the books, the keynotes, the workshops give me an opportunity to, have a lot more relationships and a lot more conversations with a broader audience.
I was just thinking the same thing. It gives you more of a story to tell because these are all current things that are happening. You could say, "Oh, one of my clients the other day."
Every company, every CEO is thinking about like, how do I, essentially, how do I compete in the digital era, right? Like, what's the best digital version of my business, and how do I get there? How do I pay for it? How do I migrate to it? How do I not destroy my existing business and build into a new one? Each of those, digital transformation scenarios needs to be bespoke. It needs to be custom. It needs to be the right thing for that leadership team and for that business. And that's really the work that I love doing with my clients, is helping them, figure out like, hey, what's your next horizon? Like what does your business need to be next? And, what leadership approaches do you need to transition a little bit? How do you need to migrate your culture? How does your strategy need to adjust? What new tools and technology do you need in order to enable this capability? That subtle play on levers is really what real strategy and real change creation is about.
Which one of the tenets do you find the hardest to follow?
Well, I know where I have failed the most in my career, and that is the think big leadership principle. And I just grew up in environment where, you didn't have big dreams. And I didn't grow up in a, where I was like, oh yeah, John, you can do everything. And so I find myself always having to remind myself, and my wife does a good job of like, John, think a little bigger on this, like, and so, and the leadership principle reads like this. It reads, thinking small is a self-fulfilling prophecy. Leaders create and communicate a bold direction that inspires results. They think differently and look around corners for ways to serve customers. And so that's the one where I never, really start with a super big vision and then work backwards. So that's one. And then, the one that I work with my clients the most on is the leadership principle that's titled Invent and Simplify. And the interesting thing on that leadership principle, it's the and simplify part of that leadership principle that I work with most of my clients on. Most of my clients are bigger enterprises. They have just inherent complexity in their products, in their organization, in their processes, in their communications, in their, everything that they do. And the most important thing you can do is, like, back to the book editing, pare it back, make it minimalist value added activity. And when you pare back everything about your business to like, what is the essential value add things that I do? What you find is you do everything so much better. You serve your customers better. You have more resources to deploy to those things that are critical relative to your growth. People enjoy everything about their jobs and the business better because you're not fighting all of this internal calcification that used to go on. So it's the and simplify piece that I work with most of my clients on relative to kind of like their operating environment.
Yeah. So, I mean, and I know a lot of turnaround companies do that too. Like, okay, we have to remove all of this complexity. Do you do
Well,
just
so
that?
so the firm that I was a partner at, it was called Alvarez Marcel, which is one of the premier restructuring firms. And so you're absolutely right. Like, I got to deploy and see that in action, which is like, a big part of crisis management and restructuring and kind of, pulling out of a dip for a company is like paring back to the essentials.
Yeah. So you essentially look at it like, all right, if we were in survival mode, like what are the things that we would need to make sure that this thing is functioning?
Well, I think that's one question you would ask, and the other one you would ask is you work from your customer backwards. Like, what exactly does my customer value, and what are they willing to pay for? What is my brand promise, and am I delivering? And anything that doesn't directly support or works against that, you rationalize to the hilt, right? And so
Yeah.
that's more of a customer driven, kind of zero based approach to simplification in an organization.
I like that approach better. Yeah. It's
No,
whatever.
they're both value added approaches. Typically in these situations, you can't ask just like one really smart question to get to the magic of it or the essence of it, right? You got to approach it from a couple of interesting kind of thought experiments that you do relative to that. So they're both good questions.
So as far as like your career and what you've developed into now, like as that challenge, what would you say the part that you found the most difficult thing for you to overcome?
uh, Understanding the power of storytelling. And I'm an engineer. I approach things from more of an analytical framework and perspective and, core belief system. And that telling a compelling story as a business leader, coupled with a great strategy plan and execution, like that's a killer combination. Jeff Bezos is once again, like, I think one of the best examples of doing that. Like he was always keeping us, on point. This whole, like, the leadership principles, keeping us on point. He always had this mantra of it's day one, right? And what he meant was like, we need to be optimistic about inventing the future and creating the future versus reacting to it. But he just had this simple approach to communicating, which was day one, and everything, right? And so finding those little simple storylines, one of the great tags I've heard as a leader is you want to be a CRO, a chief repeating officer. And
Hmm.
what a chief repeating officer does is tell that consistent, simple story, but then you're able to unpack it for the right audience, for the right purpose, right? So, you might go around saying like, oh, invent and simplify, but at some point, like when you're in an operating meeting, you go invent and simplify. In this moment, here's what invent and simplify means, right? And so you unpack it, you leverage it, but then you deploy it for action. And so you need to think of this, one of the key concepts in communication is called a message house, right? And a message house is a set of structured messages that are all rationalized and roll up to one core message at the top, but then it breaks down into, depending upon your audience and your situation, well, what's the right message point for this point? So you need to be really on point and strategic about your set of structured messages. That's storytelling.
I've never even heard of this message house. That's intriguing. Like, how did you get better at storytelling?
No purposeful plan. I mean, part of it was kind of through the books. Keynote speaking has forced me to be simple, direct, on point, and tell a cohesive story both across the entire keynote, but also for each little step relative to that keynote. And I've just educated myself. Like I have dug into structured communication, messaging, and storytelling as a discipline, and I use that as a strategy with my clients. And there's a close connection between what a value proposition is and what your brand is and storytelling, and that combination of really understanding your customers, what's your value proposition to your customer, the pains and gains that you're giving them, how you're going to distinguish yourself, and then what your brand is, your brand promise relative to that, what your products and services are, how they're tied to that, and then how you tell that story both to the market and to your organization. Like, that's a combination of disciplines together that I find really powerful in the work I do, which is primarily kind of strategy setting.
Yeah, and it sounds like you've taken a systematic approach to just line up all these things that's got you here. Like, you looked at it like an engineer and saying like, okay, what is the design of this based on putting this puzzle piece together?
Well, I travel a lot, both for business and personally. And what I've done is a couple of years ago, I was like, I'm going to start putting better content into myself, right? Like if you're an athlete, and especially the older you get, your nutrition becomes more and more important, right? And I kind of thought about it the same way, which is like, I want to up level the level of content, the learning that I'm doing. And so through podcasts, through the reading, through Audible books, I kind of tried to cut out, the junk food, the empty calories, and just explore new topics from other people and other thought leaders. And it hasn't been as directive or thought through as you would say, but I do manage the type of content that I take in, and I am a voracious content consumer.
What has been the most helpful? Like, it could be a book, it could be an author, it could be a podcast, anything.
Yeah. Well, one that I really like, there's a newsletter my friend Christopher Lochhead writes. He's actually got a team, 3 partners. It's called Category Pirates. And they do, I think, a perfect job of defining a set of frameworks for defining what your category is as a business, and really exploding that entire concept. And it kind of comes to some of the things we've talked about as far as market differentiation. And they do it in a really kind of funny, tight manner. And so he's somebody that I've learned a lot, both from a technique standpoint, as well as his content, this category definition content I've found as really explosive.
Like, what is your category exactly?
I help companies compete and win in the digital era. That's my category. So it's strategy and operations, but I pull a set of levers that most advisors or consultants don't pull. I pull leadership, culture, strategy, and tools and technology to create an outcome. Most consultants only pull one of those levers at a time. Right. And I see it as a system, right? Like, these things work together. They're not isolated. you need to understand each as a discipline, but when I'm working with a client to understand like, well, what's the right thing to do here, I think through all of those levers. And that's my category is, disciplined approach of creating bespoke, i.e. customized strategies and plans for my customers on how they're going to compete in the digital era. And I use leadership, culture, strategy, tools, and technology levers in order to help them accomplish that.
Got it. So if, what would you say? I mean, we've covered a lot here. What would you say that the world should know that we haven't covered?
I think what the world should know that we haven't talked about is, the biggest risk most companies have is not wandering enough in finding new markets, new customers, new capabilities. Everybody gets so optimized, and so that's kind of what your traditional management science muscle set is about, is optimization, right? I figured out my product, I figured out my service, I know how to serve the market, I optimize that muscle set. And you lose or you atrophy the wandering muscle set, which is like, how do I innovate? How do I find new markets, new customers? And so the biggest risk that most companies face is that they've over muscled optimization and they've under muscled finding new markets, wandering and innovating.
What's the equilibrium there? Because there's so much stuff out there that always says, stay away from the shiny things. You got to focus on this. Like where, you know what I mean? Like where does that exist?
Yeah, the equilibrium is you actually have to have a system for how you innovate, how you wander and everything. If think about it. I always ask an audience, I go, I'll ask them like, okay, raise your hand if you think that innovating, finding new customers, finding new markets is critical for your company's success over the next 5 to 10 years, right? Everybody will raise their hand. And then I'll ask, who actually has a system, a process, a set of metrics, resource allocation, a decision-making framework, a test and learn approach relative to that? Rarely does anybody raise their hand, right?
Right.
You know who does that really well is pharmaceutical companies. They are engineered to test and learn, to try new things, right? Not many companies, not many categories of companies are engineered like that. So the discipline is understanding, I need a separate playbook for how I do innovation and wandering. Now, we need to have a deliberate conversation about how much resource, how much allocation do we put to that? But even if you just make that eyes wide open decision, you're making progress. Like you are deliberately saying like, hey, here's how we go about doing this in the right amount that's needed there. It doesn't have to be a ton. And you can calibrate kind of your horizons relative to your ambition, right? Do I need more short-term payback, well understood initiatives? Or do we need a couple of, kind of big, bets? They're big ideas, but you bet small on them, right? So you never bet the enterprise. You never, when you're betting, you never bet more than you can afford to lose. And so you figure out, how do I make really small test cases in order to learn and prove out a concept? So that's some of the skills you need to build to counterbalance that optimization skill set.
Got it. I guess one way to look at it is, tell people, I'm hiring you as a bunch of losers, but we're not gonna, or potentially, you could be a winner, but we'll see how this pans out.
Well, but that's one of the, tricky things about innovation is, and this is where leadership really matters, is, I always talk about the right question at the wrong time, right? And how it can absolutely kill like an innovation concept. So what's an example of the right question at the wrong time? So, say I'm presenting a big idea relative to you, a concept about something that I have no basis for really proving out, but hey, we think this is a real customer problem, a real customer need. There's a market there, a little bit of an idea on how we might approach it. And somebody asks, what's the business case for that? Right? Your CFO asks, or somebody asks, well, what's the business case for that? Guess what you've just done? You've completely you've torpedoed, exactly. I think that was a torpedo sound you were making. You've torpedoed the culture, the spirit, and now you've made it, whoever that leader was, oh gosh, now I have a torpedo aimed right at me, right? And well, what are they going to do? They're going to retract. They're going to go back to a safe zone, all of those things. And so That's the type of leadership and culture training and mistake that companies make all the time. They take their traditional management science questions. It's a good question. What's the payback? What's the ROI? How are you going to prove it? But you apply it at the wrong time.
Right. So how should they go about that? Is it just like you said?
You have to ask the right question at the right time. You have to understand, well, where is this idea at? And we need to engineer, we need to design the right thing to do for the types of questions that we need to answer relative to where this concept is. If we understand it really well, then ask, well, what's your go-to-market plan? What's your business plan? What's your ROI on it? If we don't understand it well, then you go, well, how are we going to test it? How are we going to go talk to customers? How are we going to do a competitive review? How are we going to identify the total addressable market or total addressable problem? You have to ask the right question at the right time. Well, that takes some awareness and training to do that.
Yeah, and now that you mention it, I've noticed something. There's companies that typically go out of business. Either they weren't innovative enough, or B, they were just stretching too far and they didn't have a system in place. And also to say, there's also, I know a ton of slow growth companies that hit these ceilings because they are wildly incapable of even attempting to think in a different direction. It's just like, nope, this is what we do. And whatever the market throws at us, we're just going to keep chewing on it.
One of the secondary kind of mistakes bigger enterprises make is they do have a new concept, they do have a new idea, and they have some promising early results from it. And the mistake they make is they go, great, let's go big. And they decide to go big before they've proven out everything that you kind of need to prove out before you scale, right? Unit cost, operations, sales and channel and distribution, all your marketing, all the product and service refinement, right? They go big too early. They go big prematurely. And so again, you need to understand, like, there's a set of gates or hurdles that you need to understand before you decide, like, oh, I've got a really good idea. I've got some good early indications. The next step typically isn't go big, right? The next step is something intermediary, like, oh, do I have this operationally perfected so that I'm ready to go to market?
Yeah, small failures, big wins. I like it.
I like it.
All right, John, how can people get a hold of you?
So I write a newsletter called the Digital Leader Newsletter. You can find that on Substack. It's free. You can find the Amazon Way at Amazon, paperback, Kindle, Audible. And you can find me at rossmanpartners.com or on LinkedIn, John Rossman.
Awesome. John, thank you so much for being here, man. This was great.
Thank you.
Hope you enjoyed our episode. Please subscribe and review wherever you can. And if you would like to join the Digital Mastermind, go ahead and shoot me an email at john@digitalmastermind.com or visit us at digitalmastermind.com. We'll see you next time. Thanks. Bye now.